Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all this afternoon to our briefing on the state of the global refugee crisis. For those of you that haven't met me, I'm Anne-Marie Gray, the Executive Director and CEO of USA for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. I am so pleased that you're able to join us today. Today, we've gathered a select group of partners, supporters, and other key stakeholders from a range of sectors and particular interests, all of you united by your dedication to refugees and humanitarian issues. We're coming together to learn more about and discuss the current global refugee crisis with two of UNHCR's top experts. Joung-ah Ghedini-Williams, who is UNHCR's head of global communications, and Matt Reynolds, UNHCR's representative for the US and Caribbean. As many of you know, every June, UNHCR releases its Global Trends Report, which is an in-depth analysis of the current emergencies impacting refugees and other forcibly displaced populations. This year's report was released on Friday, and it outlines developments since the previous report, new and continuing trends, and this year, notably, impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This afternoon, we'll start our discussion with Joung-ah, who will give us an overview and key highlights from the report. And then we're going to turn to Matt, who will discuss UNHCR's policy priorities through a Washington, D.C. lens. We will then turn to questions from all of you, moderated by Jennifer Simon, our Senior Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement. So let's get started. As mentioned, Joung-ah Ghedini-Williams heads up UNHCR's global communications and is a seasoned strategic communications veteran on humanitarian and refugee issues, having held senior roles at UNHCR around the globe for over 15 years, following prior service in the NGO sector. I should also note that the bulk of Joung-ah's experience is in the field. She's currently based in Geneva, and we are so appreciative of her expertise, her leadership, and that she's able to join us during one of the busiest times of year for UNHCR. Joung-ah, thank you for being here, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and thank you for allowing me to speak to all of you. I think the role that you all play as partners, as donors, as our advocates and ambassadors in your own networks is critical. As Anne-Marie mentioned, I've been with UNHCR actually 25 years. I almost am embarrassed to admit that, but 15 years of that have been in the field. So they've been in all of the emergencies that you see oftentimes on the news. And I think that's essentially why I've lasted as long as I have in UNHCR. It's those experiences and meeting the people behind the numbers that really make the difference for all of us that work for UNHCR. So I'll go ahead and start by giving a few of the highlights, and along the way, of course, interjecting some of the anecdotes and the very insightful trends that we've noticed across the last year. As Anne-Marie mentioned, we're really looking at these statistics in the lens of a very unique and challenging year. So if you could go to the next slide, please. What you'll see is a huge number. 82.4 million becomes a number so large that most people, in a way, can't even conceive of what that means. But we're talking about 82.4 million children, women, men. These are students and engineers and teachers and bakers. These are people just like you and me who are forced to flee for no reason or option or control within their own power. These are people that are fleeing war, violence, persecution. They're fleeing, oftentimes it's not only violation of human rights, but also complicated by so many other factors, such as climate-induced incidents, as well as, of course, the protection related, so the human rights related difficulties that come with displacement and conflict. And one thing that we saw is that while most of us were forced to stay in our own homes, often for the safety of ourselves, our families, and others in our own community, what we didn't see was an end or a cessation of violence, of conflict, of these types of human rights violations. And we saw a huge increase in the number of people that literally had to run for their lives, notwithstanding the risks that were added to this flight because of the COVID pandemic. So as you'll see, the green sector of the numbers is internal displacement. And what's interesting about this is that oftentimes it is the dark blue, the refugee numbers, which are a bit more proportionally large. But this year, because of so many of the travel restrictions and because of the lack of access to territories and asylum that people faced, they ended up being what we almost consider refugees within their own countries, or IDPs, internally displaced people. So people across many parts of the world who would normally have gone to seek asylum elsewhere ended up being internally displaced in their own countries, often facing continuing hardship, conflict, danger, risk, particularly for women and girls who saw a huge increase in the exposure to sexual and gender-based violence, to very dangerous practices, survival sex, early marriage, all of these type of things that were almost ways for them to try to mitigate the risks involved with the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. So oftentimes what's deceiving is that people think that the majority of refugees flee to Western countries in the global north. But it's simply not true. The vast majority, over 85%, are actually hosted by neighboring countries, most of which are either poor or developing countries. So as you see, the largest numbers still remain in Turkey. This is largely Syrian refugees, but also Iraqi and Afghan refugees. Colombia, which houses so many Venezuelans who were displaced by the upheaval back home in Venezuela. Pakistan, which is mainly Afghan refugees, but also many other nationalities coming from Africa and elsewhere. Uganda, which has one of the most inclusive and hospitable asylum policies, where refugees from all over, from Central African Republic, from South Sudan, even from the Great Lakes countries like Rwanda and Burundi, have found a place where they are given a plot of land, given full access to healthcare, education, and all the other basic rights that citizens of Uganda have as well. And finally, the only European country or global north country to make this top 5 list is Germany. And most of the refugees that arrived in Germany arrived during the years between 2015 and 2018, predominantly from Syria and Afghanistan. Next slide, please. One of the things that we're most concerned about is the huge proportion of children. What we're looking at is a situation where an entire generation of children are being born into exile. Many of them obviously have limited or no access to healthcare, to education, and to the safeties that we often take granted for our own families and for our own livelihood. And the result that this can have is damaging not only to their own lives and their futures, which obviously is a huge concern to everyone, particularly UNHCR, host governments, donors, and partners, but also for the impact that this could have on the future generation, on the rebuilding of their countries once they are able to go home, and then obviously on certain protection-related risks and exposures that are then exacerbated. So the number of children that are born into situations where they don't have access to education and jobs means that there is greater risk of children ending up either conscripted into armed groups, at risk of being sexually exploited or trafficked, as well as mentioned, gender and sexual-based violence, as well as early childhood marriage. We're really concerned with this. And so what we've been doing in the past decade or so is really working very closely with other partner agencies, as well as development actors. What we're finding is that so many refugees are in a state of asylum or exile for many numbers of years because of the nature of the conflicts that are taking place around the world, which means that children are spending longer years and in fact growing up for much of their childhood in these refugee settings, most of which are not camp-based. It is not the time anymore that most refugees are housed in camps. In fact, most refugees are urban refugees. And so the fact that they're in these urban settings and unable to access the basic rights and services that most of us would like is a huge detriment, obviously, for them, but also for the countries that are hosting them that could really benefit from their talents and their contributions and their skills. Next slide, please. Finally, as I mentioned, in terms of internal displacement, what we've seen are huge rises in the past year of conflict and persecution-related forced movements of people within their own borders. So I think many of you are familiar with what happened in Ethiopia and the Tigray region in the past several months. But it also is not only those refugees, those Ethiopians that are fleeing across the border into Sudan, but the hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians who are being displaced from their own homes and villages, trying to seek safety in other parts of Ethiopia. As many of you may have read, what we are facing now in Ethiopia is not only the displacement crisis, but a looming famine as well. So as people are displaced and they have less access to humanitarian aid and support, oftentimes because the security does not allow humanitarian agencies to reach them. In the case of Ethiopia, we were one of the only agencies that actually remained on the ground and were fully present during the entire, not only the COVID pandemic, but also during the conflict and violence in the Tigray region. And what we're seeing is because of a number of factors, including the ongoing conflict that allows a lot of the insurgent armed forces to really wreak havoc unabated, unwitnessed because of less international and humanitarian presence. We also see that people aren't able to go and farm their lands. They're not able to go to their jobs. They're not able to maintain their businesses. Excuse me. And then on top of it, you have a drought, which is also leading to complications. And ultimately, all of these different issues, climate, conflict, displacement, insecurity, are leading to the threat of famine that is looming extremely large. In the Sahel region of West Africa, it's a similar situation where we have conflict, we have climate change issues, and we also have internal displacement that has wreaked havoc across several countries in the Sahel. And what we've seen is, for example, where we have already water scarcity and food scarcity, that armed factors are actually using these very limited resources as a way of controlling and manipulating the population. In a way, even using these resources to create further displacement. Mozambique has had a huge increase in the number of people that have been displaced because of the conflict, and then again impacted by a cyclone that hit and really devastated a lot of the area that displaced people were living in. So we're seeing over and over the multi-layered factors that are not only adding greater risk, but really jeopardizing the safety and well-being of people. Yemen is the largest humanitarian disaster we have in the world today. It is one where every possible thing you can think of has hit it. There is insecurity, there's climate issues, there is lack of scarcity of food, lack of access to clean water. And on top of it, there's such tremendous instability in the region as well. And what we've seen there is that we are one of the only agencies that are still active on the ground and that has a full presence. And it makes it very difficult for us to reach the people in need, because it is a day-to-day situation that changes with not only the conflict, but also all of the different risks that are related to the conflict, where one neighborhood will be undergoing all of the bombing and the live fighting, but then it will quickly spill over and you'll have huge groups of people that are forcibly displaced overnight, which then destabilizes the area they move to. Sudan has been an area that we finally started to see some stability, similar to Ethiopia. And we were really hoping that those two countries with ongoing peace processes and development would be able to have the chance to start rebuilding and having people return. But what we've seen in the past year in Sudan is not only arrivals of many from the Ethiopia-Tigray conflict, but also new displacement from Darfur. And again, we are dealing with multiple layers of complexity with the conflict and displacement in Sudan. And finally, in Afghanistan, what we've seen in the last year is a real growing sense of instability. I think now, I spoke with my colleagues on the ground just earlier this week, and they were telling me that the contingency planning that we're doing right now to deal with potential instability and an increase in violence in the coming months has everybody completely scared and uncertain of what the rest of 2021 will look like for most Afghans. On top of this, most of the countries, these 6 countries that I've briefly mentioned, are dealing with very real COVID threats. These are all areas and regions that have very limited medical resources and have little to no vaccination programs ongoing right now, simply because they're not getting the vaccination doses yet on the ground. And while around most of the rest of the world, we've seen decreases in COVID infections and deaths, just in the last week alone in Africa, the number of cases have gone up by 55% and the number of deaths have gone up by 38%. We're really looking at the issue of not only vaccine equity, but how we roll out the vaccines that we do have in a way so that they're reaching the people in the remote areas and in those areas that have little to no health facilities. Next slide, please. Or maybe that is the last slide. I thought there was one final slide. I think just as a last note, what I would say is that despite all of these challenges, which there are so many, and I have to say that in my 25 years with UNHCR, last year was the year that we had the lowest number of people who were able to voluntarily return home, as well as people who were resettled to third countries. And these solutions seem to be very few and far between. But at the same time, we've seen huge progress forward in terms of how businesses and donors, how governments and other financial institutions like the World Bank are really taking up a role as partners for UNHCR and other humanitarian organizations in looking at a more holistic and sustainable way of helping refugees and displaced people, and also creative ways to make sure that anything that we do is done in full consultation and with the empowerment and agency of the people that have been forced to flee. I'll hand over to Matt.
Thank you, Joung-ah, for an excellent presentation. I know and I can see that questions are being asked, but I'm going to ask if everyone could please hold their questions to later in the program. Feel free to send the questions to us, though. But before the questions, I'd turn to Matt Reynolds, our UNHCR representative for the US and the Caribbean. As many of you know, Matt and his team steward UNHCR's policy priorities and relationships with the US government. Matt has had a distinguished career in government service and humanitarian response, which includes, among other posts, serving as US Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs under the then Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. He's also been the UNRWA representative here in the US and has held several senior staff positions on Capitol Hill. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you all. I want to first start off with a very big shout out thank you to all of you for your strong support for USA, for UNHCR. It makes an incredible difference. Again, thank you for your contributions and your support and your advocacy. But I also want to thank you as American citizens. I happen to be an American national, but as American citizens, because of the support that our government provides to UNHCR and to refugees and to the humanitarian response around the world. You know, I'm going to speak about how we have a lot of shared interests between UNHCR and our mandate, and the generosity and the policies and humanitarian urges or supports of the United States government and USA as a general. The United States has always been, continues to be, and I hope will continue to be, UNHCR's #1 supporter, consistently and above and beyond all other countries and entities. And so part of my objective, of course, my job is to maintain that very special and valued partnership, which comes from a very high level to a very low level. The United States support comes in two principal fashions. Number one, politically, and around the globe, American leadership and American leverage allows us to help push international protection and provide refuge to so many forcibly displaced people. You know, I can always count on, my team can always count on, my colleagues in the field can always count on the US Embassy and the US government to be there in their back, because sometimes some governments don't really care about our moral authority, right? But they do care about things that certain large leaders of the world care. The second way that the US is incredibly important to us, of course, is financially. And the United States provides now up to $2 billion a year in funding for UNHCR and its operations. And this includes core funding, and includes funding for emergencies. The US is always there to do their fair share and to help take care oftentimes of the more neglected conflicts that we're unaware of. Joung-ah referred to Mozambique and to Sudan and the Sahel. These are hard to raise money for at times, but the United States is always one of the first there with their resources. So thank you, and thank to all of you. Remember that on tax day, that some of it is actually going to go to a really good cause. And similarly, right here in our own backyard in the Western Hemisphere in Venezuela and Northern Central America. Our relationship is strong. We have, as I said, with the executive, our principal interlocutor is the United States Department of State. I will be honest with you, we've had a difficult past 4 years. We've been a bit defensive. There has been some degradations, obviously, on the protection side, particularly in US asylum, and some of the foreign issues have taken a back burner. But we have maintained a strong relationship with the executive, and it has been businesslike. We now have had a change here in the United States administrations, and humanitarianism is a new high priority for the Biden administration, and particularly for Secretary of State Biden. We discovered this, the High Commissioner for Refugees was here on June 7th, and the quality of meetings and the valued partnership, the engagement, the support, the heartfelt interest across the board, the White House, the State Department, USAID, Homeland Security, was genuine and good. We also, of course, have to maintain, because of the format of the United States government, strong relations with the Congress. And UNHCR has extremely strong bipartisan and bicameral relationships. And it's a lot of that financial bedrock support comes from the Congress. And I'm very proud of that, because having spent many years in the legislative branch, I know that it, to a degree, better represents the will and the interests of the American people as their elected representatives versus a large bureaucratic executive branch. So that's been incredibly important, and again, across the board. One of the new Biden administration agenda items, which coincides with UNHCR, is to have a returned, if you will, commitment to international protection globally, regionally, and domestically. Let me just give you a quick little snapshot. Globally, we see that on the return to an interest in resettlement, to the pledge to return resettlement admissions, refugee admissions to the United States to a goal of 125,000 refugees. And that would be an all-time high. And it's a goal that we all support strongly. Regionally, and I kind of would merge these regionally and domestically because they are very much linked together. If you look at the return to protection vis-a-vis the crisis at the US border and in the sub-region, these are shared interests and they are close to home. As Sahel may be far away, Texas is not so far. As you know, there is a large mixed flow to the border, and the amount of flow is actually in quite a global size. Just this month alone, there were 180,000 encounters. That's U.S. authorities meeting up with a mixed flow of migrants and refugees on the U.S. border alone. That's so far to this year, it's 700,000. And that's an incredible increase. 95% of those are crossing in between ports of entry, i.e. kind of across the Rio Grande River. And 8% of them are unaccompanied children, which is a very high and frightening number. Many of these are here to claim asylums. This last year alone, 282,000 individuals filed for asylum in the United States. There is a backlog of processing of these, of over 1 million backlog for over 5 years. And we estimate by the end of this year, there'll be about 1.35 million files that have yet to be adjudicated. This is quite unsustainable. And this administration, or the current US government, recognizes that and appreciates that they've got to fix the system and fix it humanely and properly. So to effectively address these concerns, there is the address of it needs to be comprehensive, coordinated, recognizing that it's a very complicated, complex issue. It's a mixed flow. Not everyone is a refugee. So what's the plan? And how are we working with them? The plan is, number one, to address root causes, as we've seen in the countries of origin, primarily Guatemala, where 18% come from, Honduras, 15%, and El Salvador, 11%. The U.S. provides both political and financial support for our regional protection operations and support for IDP, the internally displaced peoples in Honduras and El Salvador, for building asylum capacities, for strengthening civil society safety nets, and for community outreach. We're just one of many columns that address the root causes, but we're in the protection column. Then you've got part two, which is the transit through Mexico, and an important opportunity, again, with U.S. financial and political support is building the asylum system in Mexico, because many from Central America can find safety and refuge and a future in Mexico, and they are being welcomed by Mexico. But the system still needs strengthening. There's a very important process, which is an integration project. I know that you and Anne-Marie and another opportunity will probably give you more description, but this is a very important process of helping these asylum seekers integrate, get good employment, housing, and find a new life in Mexico. But some, and this is the third part, some do need to still have access to protection in the United States through the US. The US is still an important place of asylum. The United States, like so many others, has international obligations and a humanitarian policy of admission. So even there, we're available, working very closely with the United States government on helping that asylum reform and helping with those that do cross the border. Now, America is a rich and well-developed and strong structural country, but given the overwhelming numbers and given the situation that's going on, we're here to provide our experience, expertise, guidance, particularly on things like unaccompanied children and other places where there may be some weaknesses in the US system. And we're here to serve as a facilitator, help coordinate with shelters, NGOs, local, municipal, and the federal government as well. And I know that, again, shout out to Anne-Marie and her team, that U4U also supports things here, like an important program providing legal services and protection for unaccompanied and other children that are caught in this web. So we do have a lot of shared interests. We do have a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of challenges. But we're here to work cooperatively together, as we do with so many other countries around the world. And of course, with U4U, without whose advocacy and support in the country and here in the United States, Americans speaking to Americans about refugees is a very important role that's played. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Matt. I'll hand over now to Jennifer Simon, our Senior Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement.
Very good. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thank you, Matt and Joung-ah. Now moving to the question and answer portion of this afternoon. If you do have questions for Matt and Joung-ah, you can submit them now by clicking the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom window, and they will answer as many questions as possible in the time that we have remaining. As our guests are adding their questions, I'd like to kick off this section with a question for each of you. Joung-ah, I'll start with you. In your opening presentation, you touched on the crisis and the tragedy which we have all been grappling with for the past year and a half of COVID-19. And you mentioned the importance of vaccine equity for refugees and displaced populations. I'm wondering if you could also speak a bit more about that, how the pandemic has impacted refugee and displaced populations, both from a health as well as an economic perspective, and how UNHCR has been responding.
Thank you. That's a really pertinent question. I think we're only starting to fully understand the impact that COVID-19 has had on people that have been forced to flee. We've just published a survey that we did together with the World Bank from Uganda. And as I mentioned, Uganda is one of the places that actually is the most inclusive for refugees. So refugees are given nearly the same rights and services and privileges as Ugandan citizens. I think some of the only ones they're not allowed to do is to vote or to run for office, but otherwise they really have full access to all the services. And what we found from a very wide survey is that there is a huge increase in the number of refugees who are now living well below the poverty line. So we're talking about incredible numbers of people who are basically living on one meal a day. Also in terms of access to jobs. So we know that the economies have been hit everywhere. It's not that we're not feeling it in places everywhere around the world, but I think many refugees also depend on the informal sector for work. So they're working as day laborers, they're working as part-timers. And so those jobs are the first ones that have gone. In addition to that, one of the things that we're particularly concerned about is the levels of mental health issues that have been noted in the survey. So it's the attempted suicide numbers, as well as the sheer percentage of refugees who've responded saying that they're in need of mental health support. I believe that the number of people who've requested mental health support is over half of the people that we talked to, which was not the case 1 year before when we did a similar survey. In addition to that, I think one thing that we've seen from the pandemic around the world is the increase in domestic violence and abuse against women and girls. And it's the same, if not even more alarming for women and girls that are reporting. I believe it was almost a 40% increase in the number of incidents that have been recorded. So taking all of that into account, and if we just use Uganda as one microcosm of it, what we're looking at is years of impact. How do we go about, I didn't even mention education, because that is such a huge situation where, I mean, obviously many of our own children also were unable to go to school, but we probably had ways to access online school. Even if online learning was not ideal, they were getting at least some access to education. Many of the children in refugee or internally displaced situations have no access at all. And so we're talking about people who are on the move. So for that reason, not going to school, children not going to school, but then on top of it, because of the pandemic, again, just lengthening and deepening the type of long-lasting impact that this may have on these populations.
Thank you. Matt, you spoke of the Biden administration's commitment, many commitments to refugees and humanitarian issues. You also mentioned specifically the goal of increasing U.S. refugee resettlements to 125,000 annually. Can you put this number in context of global resettlement numbers? And can you also speak to the infrastructure that will need to be rebuilt in order to welcome more refugees to the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you. This would return the United States to being the #1 resettlement country, where it has now slipped. I believe last year, for UNHCR purposes, Canada became #1, and would return there. But you know, less than 1% of all refugees are able to ever be resettled. The numbers of needs far outstrip the amount of places. But a couple of important things about the U.S. commitment. #1 is it's also providing a leadership commitment to encourage others. It's very difficult to advocate to other countries to take particularly global north, to take more refugees when they can turn and say, yeah, but look at what's happening in the United States. Well, look at what's happening in the United States. The numbers are certainly going to increase. And if you look at the impact it's in the United States, it's quite positive. I would point out that all refugee admissions, while the UNHCR may help identify some of the most vulnerable people that need this third country resettlement, it is the role of the United States government to choose and to vet and to accept those refugees. So this is not the UN, as some critics come and say the UN is imposing things on the United States. Not at all. We're providing a long, and we've got a pipeline of people, a long group of people that the US can choose from to help improve their lives in the future. This is also a very politicized issue, as we all know here in the United States, sometimes fairly unfairly. So we are working closely with the administration to help ramp up the numbers. The challenge is that over the last 4 years, frankly, the infrastructure has been degraded and in some cases dismantled. And it does take time to build that back. You just need the refugee officers to do the interviews, to do the vetting, to do the screening. The refugee agencies, because a lot of partners and NGOs actually take care and help integrate refugees when they come to the United States. They've been dismantled over the last few years. So it takes a little bit of time. And I would urge patience to those who are anxious for seeing lots of numbers. The important thing to do is the commitment is there, I think, from this administration. The commitment is clearly on UNHCR side to help. But we also need to make sure it's done prudently and right and carefully so that we don't make mistakes, so that we don't give critics a leg to stand on, and we can help show to the American people and to all around the globe that settling vulnerable refugees in your own home country is actually a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Now I'll turn to questions coming in from our guests, and I'm going to combine two that focus on climate change and the intersection of climate change and displacement. Joung-ah, if I could direct this to you, and you did touch on some of this in your briefing. Again, where are we seeing the greatest numbers of people fleeing due to climate change or natural disasters linked to climate change? How is UNHCR helping these people? And is it helpful to create this linkage or to speak of this linkage between climate change and displacement, or is that really conflating two separate issues?
So I don't think it's conflating at all. I think what we're seeing is that climate change is definitely multiplying the risk of displacement. So what we're seeing is that there is a disproportionate of places that are vulnerable to climate incidents. So this is drought, these are cyclones, these are, floods, that disproportionately affect those places that already have the risk of displacement, whether it's because of ongoing conflict, whether it's because of the type of human rights violations and other situations. So what we're seeing is that climate then adds another layer to the situations that we're dealing with. I think what makes it difficult for us as well is that it really does further jeopardize people, and it puts them at greater exposure. As I mentioned, a lot of the places where you have scarcity of resources, whether it's food, agricultural resources, medicine, even water, there are armed elements that are taking advantage of the level of insecurity and then the level of climate-related incidents, and using those resources like water in areas where there are severe drought. You're seeing these armed elements that are basically setting up armed guards around watering holes and using that as a way to manipulate the civilian populations, which then of course leads to further displacement. And then when you do have people that are normally, for example, the fact that, maybe in a region, thousands of people who normally would be farming the land are not, that actually leads to more vulnerability of the land being further hit by drought because it's not being regularly cultivated. So you're seeing all of these factors are kind of playing together. I think the other issue is that what we see is that there is a huge impact on environment. And so, for example, where we have some 1 million refugees, Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, the impact that we've seen to an area that already is susceptible year on year to floods and cyclones, of having much of the national forests and the only parts of the ecosystem that has, for example, woods and wild animals. So a lot of the elephant population, they've been decimated because people are looking for wood basically to cook and to heat their homes when it gets colder. And so when you have an entire area that's deforested, then of course it's more vulnerable as well to the climate incidents as well. So we're seeing, it's almost feeding upon each other in terms of the adding and the escalating of the risk. And in terms of what we're doing, we are definitely, first of all, we're working very closely with environmental agencies, with climate actors on how we can help create more sustainable programming and responses. We've changed our entire way of looking at energy. So we've worked with private sector partners like IKEA, for example, to set up solar farms everywhere so that people are not necessarily going and cutting down trees to look for the same type of energy source. We've also changed the way that we're providing cooking fuels because we've seen the impact that that's also had on the environment, which then affects climate as well. But I think it's also, it's part of a growing cycle of what can we do to ensure that climate action happens now, because we've actually seen almost 4 times the number of people that have had to be displaced from their homes due to climate incidents than we have by man-made incidents like conflict.
Wow. I'm going to squeeze in one more question before turning back to Anne-Marie. And I'll also note in advance, for those of you who have submitted questions and we haven't had time to answer them, please feel free to reach out by email. You can use the same email address as you did to RSVP for this event, and we're happy to send you follow-up information through that channel. One more question for you, Matt, also from a guest, also a very timely issue. Can you speak to the efforts to resettle Iraqi and Afghani translators and others who have supported U.S. military in conflict, and the priority, whether this truly is a priority for the current administration?
Yes, there are actually, this is not a major role for UNHCR because the United States does have, through its own immigration laws, special immigrant visas that sort of fast track these populations of great interest to the United States. However, many Afghans and Iraqis in their own right have protection needs and could be eligible, if you will, for refugee admissions because of the vulnerabilities that they have. And it may not just be because of association with the United States. In fact, it's discrimination. It could be torture somewhere. It could be conflict and so on. So we're looking at the larger vulnerabilities and populations, knowing, if you will, that a certain population, the U.S. has made its own. As somebody used to work in the legislature, it's made a carve out in American laws. But we're there to help everyone, especially if they do flee across borders to Pakistan or Iran or others. We do have these contingency plans, as Joung-ah noted.
Very good. Thanks to both of you, and thanks to everyone who contributed to our conversation this afternoon. We're just at time, so Anne-Marie, I will turn the floor back to you for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Joung-ah. It's wonderful to have you be able to present today, to share, and to answer questions. I know this is a very, very busy time for you. I'd also like to echo Matt's thank you, and that is to our participants, our supporters, and our partners. We couldn't do this work without you. Thank you so much. Goodbye.